change that unit of analysis.
We got to know what we're measuring, right?
Yeah, we need to shift our thinking from how much does this person produce to instead asking, how does this person affect organizational productivity?
A dashboard can show productivity, revenue, publications, or sales, but it probably won't show the people who stopped asking for help, the group that has learned to work around the person, or those who transferred to a different group or left the organization entirely.
Our goal here isn't to squash that person's ambition or punish productivity. We absolutely need and want talented, ambitious, highly productive people, but the best performers make other people better. Welcome to Science of Leadership, where we explore leadership both practically and scientifically. What makes great leadership? Why these things matter and how we can do them well. Those are the questions we wrestle with through thoughtful discussions and real-world stories. I'm Tom Collins, and I'm joined by my friend and co-host Justin Hamrick. Justin, today we're beginning a 5-part series on one of the most difficult people a leader may have to manage, and that is the highly productive, selfish person. This is that person who generates impressive results, but repeatedly places personal success above the success of anyone else. Their accomplishments are easy to see. They create a lot of things that are positive for them, but there are costs that come with it, and those costs are harder to identify. Over the course of this series, we're going to examine how leaders should think about these individuals, why organizations tolerate them, whether they can change, and what leaders should do when they cannot or will not change. So today we begin with a foundational question. Is this person truly productive, or are they merely producing a lot? So Justin, thinking about this topic as we were, coming into it, I was trying to think of a great example, and a story that really came to mind was Terrell Owens. And I know you're familiar with him. He was one of the greatest wide receivers in the history of professional football. He was big, he was fast, exceptionally strong, remarkably well-conditioned, and he finished his career near the very top of the NFL's all-time rankings in receiving yards and in receiving touchdowns. He could dominate a game. He was eventually inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame. There was never much doubt at all about his talent. There was also rarely much doubt that T.O. wanted the football. He wanted to be central to the offense. He wanted recognition for what he accomplished. He publicly expressed dissatisfaction when he believed quarterbacks were not throwing him the ball enough, and his relationships with teammates, coaches, organizations, even fans repeatedly became strained. One of the most consequential examples came during his time with the Philadelphia Eagles. T.O. joined a team that had already been highly successful, but just couldn't seem to get there with regard to the Super Bowl. In his first season with the Eagles, he was spectacular. They made it to the Super Bowl, and T.O. returned from a significant leg injury to play exceptionally well in the game. The following season, however, there was this swirling conflict between him and Donovan McNabb, who was the quarterback, concerns over T.O.'s contract, the organization, and all of this tumult was becoming increasingly public, and the situation deteriorated to the point that the Eagles suspended him and eventually released him. And what makes this story so instructive for us as we're talking about this is that Terrell Owens didn't suddenly lose his ability to play football. He was still extremely talented, and he could still produce on the field. He continued to put up substantial numbers for other teams, but organizations repeatedly had to ask whether the value of what he produced outweighed everything that came with it. So that's the story that I wanted to kind of lead with as we get into this conversation.
There's so many, even as you're talking about this, there's so many examples of that. And professional football is one of those that's always sort of out there in the forefront. Either that or basketball is like, they have a prima donna. That's usually how they're referred to, where they're like, can we take the hit to our locker room? We know what they can do on the field. Is the squeeze worth the juice? How much, and what you talked about, that sort of back and forth, I'm glad that we're going to get into, of how much is too much? What are you willing to sacrifice in culture, in other members of the team to say, well, that person is worth it. They produce enough that is towards our goal, whether it's winning a game or whatever, that they're worth it. And that really clear tension is sort of what we're talking about today. In the NFL, the individual statistics are there, right? Like the stuff you mentioned, we can count receptions, yards, touchdowns. We can point to the game where a player obviously helped us win, and those contributions are visible and difficult to dispute. But football is also one of the more interdependent forms of work imaginable. I mean, a wide receiver can't throw the ball to himself. He depends on the quarterback, the offensive line, the coaches, the other receivers, and everyone else to play their roles so that the offense can work. So even with a uniquely talented player, the leader still has to ask whether the individual helping the entire system function or whether the whole system is being forced to revolve around that person.
That leads us to the question that we really want to explore today. What should a leader do with someone who produces exceptional individual results, but makes the team around them miserable, less effective, so forth? I mean, ultimately, that's really the question that people are trying to get at, right?
Well, let's begin how we always begin. Let's define a little more what we're talking about. We're not talking about every ambitious person, every person that's just trying to do better. Ambition is not selfishness. Competitiveness is not necessarily selfishness. Wanting to excel, achieve, advance, receive appropriate recognition, that's not inherently wrong. Organizations need people who care about results, right? I mean, they care about the goal. They need people who set high standards and work hard to try to achieve those things. That's not what we're talking about. So, Tom, what are we talking about? Where's the flip side of that? When does that go wrong?
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem really arises when someone's individual pursuit of success, individual success, comes at the expense of the group, of the other people, the offensive line, the quarterback, if you will. We're using those terms in place of whatever it may be on your team as you're listening, but that selfish high performer, they may demand help, but rarely offer it. If we look at them, they may hoard information or opportunities. They claim a disproportionate amount of credit, consume more than a reasonable share of resources, and prioritize their personal metrics over the organization's actual mission. They may even undermine colleagues who might compete with them or treat other people primarily as instruments for their own advancement. And because this person produces visible results that you can quantify, the organization may continue describing them as a high performer. And that's what we're really getting at here.
Yeah, and I think that label of even high performer can become part of the problem, right? Like it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. I think once people decide that someone is a high performer or a key individual, they begin interpreting almost everything else through that assumption. Almost like that the standards or the operating procedure doesn't apply to that person. I mean, that was a lot of the problem with Terrell Owens is I think the team felt like the rules and the standards that they were held to didn't apply to that person. If the person becomes impatient, people say it's because they have high standards. If they dismiss others, people say that they are simply focused on excellence. If they refuse to help, people say that their time is too valuable. Whereas if they sort of applied those to other people on the team, they wouldn't get the same, I'm going to use the word grace, but not really even that. They wouldn't get the same consideration that, oh, that's just who they are. If they generate conflict, people assume everyone else must be unable to keep up. The person's output or their performance becomes the defense. Like I think a lot of times of the operating room where you may have a really important or notarized surgeon that their time becomes more important than everybody else. So you see other teams getting their cases bumped, moved around, delayed because, oh, well, this has got to happen. And that's really a good example of how it can affect other people because of the way people might be viewing that quote unquote high performer.
You're right. I mean, as you were talking, it's almost like this sense of a bias, right? Like a kind of bias. Okay, well, this person's a high performer, so I'm going to have a predetermined response whenever they act poorly, whenever they don't work as a good team member. So that was one thing I was thinking of as you were talking. Then, yeah, in medicine, and our listeners who aren't in medicine are probably like, these guys talk about surgeons a lot, but seriously, that is the quintessential example when you want to talk about a bad actor. Now, to be fair, hear me, not even the majority, I would say at this point in time, probably in the past it was, but only a small percentage of surgeons would fall into that category as prima donna, I think, in my experience, but they are definitely the most obvious, the most glaring. So that's one thing that I want to clarify for folks who are out there listening. We're not trying to disparage all surgeons. It's just that in our experience in medicine, those are the ones who boil to the top as being examples of this most often.
Well, it's like on the football field, they're part of the skill players, right?
Right.
I mean,
yeah.
it's
Nobody's listening to, the nose guard.
Yeah.
Nose
Like
guard's
you don't
raising all
hear
kinds of trouble.
about right tackle being a real problem in the locker room because of, they're such a prima donna. Like that. I don't think I've ever heard of that.
Yeah.
So like,
right.
I mean, that's part of what we're talking about.
Yeah. And I think in this, and when we're talking about these highly productive, high performer types, organizations begin treating the person's productivity as an established fact, while they seem to see everything else as negotiable, as a different thing in a sense, right? And I think we need to distinguish here, as I'm talking about this, between two ideas that are often treated as synonymous, and they're not. And that's individual production and organizational productivity. A person, and we're talking about a high performer here in this situation, may produce a great deal individually, but reduce the overall productivity of organization as a whole. So imagine that you have, in our situation in medicine, one faculty member or in the field of sales, or a salesperson, athlete, research, whatever it is, whatever field that you're in, that person, let's say, produces 20% more than their peers. That may look impressive. Let's say it was 100% more. Let's say that this person produces 200% of what everybody else is, producing. That's great. But if you take, let's say, 7 people that they're impacting, and their productivity is decreased 15% because of interacting with that person, it's a net loss to the organization, because that 7 times 15, I think that's right. I was just doing that in my head. 5. Yeah. Okay. So that's 205, I think, if I'm or 215. So you've lost 15% productivity in that scenario. Okay.
Yeah. What if information is withheld? What if support staff are consumed by one individual's demands? What if their demands affect other people and their productivity? What if colleagues stop volunteering for shared work because they know that another person will take credit? What if talented people leave? What if everyone else begins imitating the behavior because they know what, sort of the new standard is and what it's rewarded?
Let me pause from our conversation to ask you, the listener, a question. Are you ready to turn leadership principles into daily practice? Are you ready to become the leader you're capable of being? If so, my new book, The 4 Stars of Leadership Development Guide, is specifically designed to help you do that. You'll get a 12-week program designed to help you strengthen your character, competence, caring, and communication. Each chapter comes with focused reflection, illustrative stories that bring the concepts to life, and concrete actions you can apply immediately. No matter where you are in your leadership journey, it's a resource that is guaranteed to help you. You can find it online at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and essentially all outlets where you get your books. Get your copy today and begin becoming the leader you're capable of being. Now let's get back to this interesting conversation.
I'm struck again by sort of a sports analogy. Like, In basketball, you can have an amazing shooter give you 50 points a game, but refuses to play defense, just never plays defense. And the team's always losing. I mean, there's so many examples of that. Baseball, guy hits the most home runs a year, but the team keeps losing. And why? Well, he refuses to go for the single and get the runner over. He's not going to bunt to get somebody across. And so the team's goal of winning is not happening because of, but you look at his stats and you're like, oh my gosh, that's Hall of Fame stats, right? Like they hit more home runs than everybody, more best slugging percentage. And you're like, well, what's the team's record? Oh, they finished last in their division.
Right.
So there's obviously examples out there. And I think when we're talking about leadership, and you started this from the very first podcast almost 2 years ago, the goal is the team. The goal is the success of the team. And if an individual's performance, when you take it for summation, if it's that they're not making the team better through their individual performance, and the net, when you take what they're taking away and what they're contributing, if that's worse, that can become a real problem.
That's the calculus that people often don't undertake, because that individual, well, look at the numbers.
Mm-mm.
We can count those numbers, right? Like we can actually put, whatever it is, sales that they made or whatever it is. But the organization may be losing so much more than that person contributes. Now, as I'm sitting here, it was 205. So you got a 5% loss. Anyway, my calculus. Anyway, but it's recognizing that it's not just this individual. We're an organization, and the ripple effects of that person, the negative impact, trying to get your hands around that and understand that, yeah, they may be publishing 100 papers a year or something insane, but what are they doing to everybody else?
I think that's the challenge, right? It's the production is usually concentrated, measurable, and visible, right? Like how many papers have you produced? How many sales have you made? Blah, blah, blah. The problem is the cost is usually dispersed, more difficult to find. A leader can point to one person and say, this person brings in this much revenue. They bring in this much patients. They bring in this much sales. The researcher has this many grants. This employee has closed this many accounts. But the losses can be spread onto 10, 20, 30 more people. And no one person's decline can be dramatic enough to draw attention. And that's a little bit of what you're going to. Like, so many, this calculus is tough to do because you don't have all the information unless you probably really go seeking after and looking for it, because it's not going to be on a quarterly spreadsheet. The sales will be, the profit will be, but the cost is not going to be on a column.
You're exactly right. And that brings us to really, a major principle for this conversation, for this podcast episode, is the appropriate unit of analysis is not simply the individual's output. It's the performance of the system around that person. Terrell Owens' statistics told us something important about him as a wide receiver. They didn't tell us everything we needed to know about the performance of the team. And the same is true in every organization.
Man, that gets into something I always think is so important, which are sometimes costs, like the impact he has on the locker room, on the team, that culture. How do you measure that? So that sort of transitioned us to the next phase of our podcast that we talked to. Like, we've defined what it is. We defined the high performer, both pros and cons. So now let's get into the so what. If the costs of having a difficult high performer, not just a high performer, like you talked about, it's not just the ambitious person, not just the successful person, not that, but the person that is detrimental and difficult to the team, and we know it. If the costs can be so substantial, why do leaders tolerate selfish high performers?
That's a good question. That's the crux of the matter, probably. From what I've seen, particularly in medicine, the answer is not often that the leader is unaware of the problem. The leader may actually see the problem, know the problem very well. They may know that people even avoid the individual. They may be aware enough to say, okay, well, this person's having negative impacts on everybody else. They may know that the person consumes a disproportionate amount of resources, and they may know that trust is deteriorating and colleagues are frustrated. But, and this is Tom's observation, maybe the leader's afraid of addressing the problem because someone above them will question their judgment.
As I remember back on times where this has landed on my plate, that makes sense, especially in institutions where the person has a highly visible measure of success. A leader might be thinking, I can see what this person is doing to the team, but the dean, chief executive, CEO, CMO, the sort of C-suite, that's too much. They're never going to have my back on this. Like I can say that this is a problem, but when that problem gets escalated, the institution is like, so wait, they're just being mean to your team? Solve it, fix it. But they're never actually going to give you the teeth to do that. The local leader experiences the damage directly. They're the ones sort of in the foxhole seeing this. Senior leaders may experience the person primarily through dashboards, rankings, awards, financial reports, those type of things. So, I mean, that to me is where the problem comes in, is the person that sort of local leader that's having to deal with those problems. They're sort of getting the brunt of those issues.
Yeah, I mean, that's the center of the discussion and problem. The person's leader may feel restricted in what they can do, right? Because the people above them are saying, hey, you know, this guy's bringing this much revenue, and that's for surgeons that are bad behaviorally bad. That's often the issue. They are bringing in millions because they do certain surgeries so well, and people are coming from all around and all that. And so the people in the C-suite are worried about the bottom line, and they think, well, this guy's bringing in 10 million or whatever, we can allow him to treat people poorly. Or, hey, this person got this many grants, doesn't that make us look good? But in truth, I see it as a larger organizational issue, you know, when we're talking about this, that this is really about psychological safety for that frontline leader. It's about trust. I think that leader feels like, you know, they're in this position, they don't feel safe in a real sense to be able to make that decision that needs to be made. Hey, this person is really bad for the organization. We need to act. So they can't make that decision because of all these accolades or whatever it is that are gaining notoriety or so forth. In the back of their mind, they can hear those voices of those people above them. Why are you confronting one of our most productive people? What happens if they leave? How will you replace the revenue? What happens to the research program? Hey, are you allowing a personality conflict to interfere with performance? Can you prove that this person is harming the organization? That's the other thing. Prove it to us. You know, people leaving right and left, burnout is high, nobody's engaged in their work that's surrounding this person. Prove it to us, right?
Yeah. And those aren't trivial questions. Like that person's contribution, especially if they're really good, like you were saying, like a receiver, like those sort of top tier receivers don't grow on trees.
Yeah.
So you may not have a legitimate replacement. That person's contribution may be real, and losing it may create genuine short-term difficulty, losing seasons, fired coaches. And it seems to me the leader is unlikely to have an easy to demonstrate the cost that selfish performer is creating. In sports, it seems like many times it takes an implosion. Like it has to come to a head where, like you were saying with Terrell Owens, it sort of falls apart. Like it genuinely, it seems like most examples of that are something has to lead to an explosion, like
Yeah.
something that is not only easily measured, but so catastrophic that it can't be ignored. But then when you look back, all these things in the past were happening and usually got ignored.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the hard thing is, unless it explodes like you're describing, how do you measure it? How do you quantify that colleague stops who stops bringing forward ideas? How do you measure the person who quietly quits in a real sense? You know, they're still
Mm,
there, but they're not given any more than they absolutely have to. Or how do you calculate the effect of people becoming guarded or transactional, not cooperating? It's hard to assign a number to things like that, you know, because th- what metric do you use? How do you put that in a spreadsheet? How
mm.
does that translate to dollars and cents? That's really hard to do. It's much easier just to say, hey, look, I can see that this person's generating that much revenue. And so you need to suck it up. And as you said, figure it out, fix it. That's your job, fix it.
Yeah.
Personality issues like this, you don't just fix. And a lot of times it may be a personality issue.
I I think that really does hit on the idea of sort of psychological safety and really the culture of the team as a whole. Like if it is one of psychological safety, it's going to be one where people do feel comfortable in doing those things, of challenging, of asking questions. And those are historically always the teams that really make a difference, that really excel. We usually discuss psychological safety in terms of whether people feel able to speak up, disagree, ask questions, or admit their own mistakes. But leaders also need psychological safety to exercise judgment. A leader may know what needs to be done, but fear that the organization will punish them for actually doing it. And in the high performers, that's no more evident. I mean, you've seen coaches that are like teams misbehaving, the high performers misbehaving, turn out, and they're like, why don't they bench them? And they're like, because they still have to win the game. That's what they're getting paid to do. And if they don't win, they know it's the right thing. But if they bench them, they lose the game. It could literally be their job.
Yeah, I think, you know, the leader is responsible for the performance and the culture of the group, but at the same time, at least, you know, in my experience and observation, they feel like they're not permitted to address one of the greatest threats to that performance and culture.
Mm.
And that lack of psychological safety, perhaps, and the organization's concern with what we might call this, my friend calls them prize ponies, right? Are really two sides of the same problem. The leader doesn't feel safe acting because the organization has communicated either directly or indirectly that certain highly visible people are more important than the health of the group. And that's really what they're communicating. The organization may say that teamwork matters, but at the end of the day, you know, no matter what they say about teamwork and respect and all that, if they repeatedly protect those highly visible producers from consequences, people receive the real message. They know what reality is when it comes to the culture and what's valued and so forth in the organization. And that can be so detrimental. So with that, let's take our science break here and look at what the research tells us about the highly productive, selfish person. So we'll touch on 3 studies. The first study is a Harvard Business School working paper by Michael Hausman and Dylan Miner, and it's called Toxic Workers. They analyzed employment data from more than 50,000 workers across 11 firms. Some of the workers who were eventually terminated for misconduct were found to complete their work faster than their peers. In that sense, they appeared productive, but when the researchers estimated the broader costs associated with those employees, particularly the additional turnover around them. It turned out that, and this is a big point here, avoiding one toxic worker was worth more than twice as much as hiring a top 1% producer. So visible individual output may coexist with a much larger, less visible organizational cost. So twice as much of a cost is what they brought in, is the short on that. And I should qualify, this wasn't a peer-reviewed paper. It's called a working paper, and it examined people who were terminated for serious misconduct, which is more severe than ordinary selfishness in the workplaces, may not directly translate to ours or those of our listeners, but still, it illustrates the problem well. The production is visible while the larger organizational costs may remain hidden. And the researchers also found that greater exposure to toxic workers was associated with a higher likelihood of later demonstrating toxic behavior. So it is contagious.
Oh, that's what I was wondering about, sort of as that, if they look and see that, okay, the standard is okay. I mean, at my orientation, it was this, this, and this, but this is what's tolerated. Okay, I'm going to do it.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. A second study shows that interpersonal behavior can affect technical performance. Riskin and his colleagues randomly assigned 24 neonatal intensive care unit teams to hear either neutral or mildly rude comments from an outside expert while they were simulating a medical emergency. So these are simulated resuscitation events. The teams exposed to the rudeness performed worse in both diagnosis and procedures. And the effect appeared to occur partly because they shared less information and sought less help. And the rude person was an outside observer rather than a selfish high performer who actually knew them. So the study is probably not as strong, because usually when it's somebody that you know who's in your team and they're behaving thusly, I think it has a bigger impact. But, because it was an outside observer who wasn't necessarily selfish, it doesn't absolutely translate to our thing, but it does demonstrate that interpersonal conduct is not separate from technical excellence.
Yeah, I mean, the knowledge and skill in the room didn't change. The real difference in that study seemed to be that the expertise wasn't converted into performance. It's an interesting study. Just bring somebody in and be like, "You're not doing a good job. It's like they put an angel on their shoulder just to be like, you're not as good as you think." Wait, who's that guy?
Interestingly enough, it wasn't even that egregious. Like, if you look into the study, the person wasn't necessarily saying, "Hey, you there," or they were just being rude. They were just sort of being rude. They weren't specifically saying, "Hey, guy doing the chest compressions, you're terrible. They're going to die. They're going to have," it wasn't like that. It was just being a little bit rude. So imagine if you have the sorts of people that we've come across in our careers who are so much further than a little bit rude, right? Like, imagine the impact that has. So a technically excellent person can still create conditions that make the team's function worse. That translates to far lower overall organizational productivity. And so the essential point here is interpersonal behavior is not separate from technical performance. I think that's an important take home. And then the third study that I'll just touch on real quickly explains, or at least helps explain, why organizations tolerate this behavior. Matthew Quaid and his colleagues conducted 3 studies involving more than 1,000 participants, and they found that unethical, and again, that's not necessarily selfish, okay, but unethical people were more likely to be rejected when they performed poorly. When those employees were high performers, people were more willing to tolerate it. So that's a pretty interesting finding.
So people may still recognize that the behavior is wrong. They simply become more reluctant to act because, in the other hand, the leadership, the institution, sees what they are producing. I mean, we see that all the time.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so when we take these 3 studies together, we can say, first, impressive individual output can conceal a much larger organizational cost. Second, negative interpersonal behavior reduces the performance of the people around the individual. And finally, high performance makes organizations more willing to tolerate behavior they would otherwise reject.
Yeah, the science does not tell us that every selfish high performer should be removed. That you just gotta cut it away, you gotta move on. But it does tell us that their individual numbers cannot settle that question. And that shouldn't be the only measurement that you're using to determine how valuable they are to the team. We have to measure not only what the person produces, but what happens to the performance and the production of the entire group because that person is there. I mean, that is sometimes really difficult to gauge.
You're right. I mean, we often treat the person's output as a benefit, and then we treat everything else as a separate interpersonal issue. And the science really suggests that those costs belong in the same calculation.
Couldn't agree more with that. But now we're going to get to the part which for this episode, I'm really excited to get into because I think this is where the meat of it'll be. Just because the one side of the calculation seems very easy. The difficult high performers, individual performance, easily measured. Usually institutions have in place their own sort of evaluation criteria for that. But on the other side, it seems that we've sort of outlined just how difficult, how widespread, how much of a ripple effect it can create, and how difficult that is to measure. But now that we've covered why this is important, let's get to the practical question. What should the leader, and here we're probably talking mostly about the local leader, the one that is most impacted over this. How do we address this extremely difficult problem?
I think since we're planning to do a series on this idea of the selfish high performer, I think for this first episode, the most important step, and we've kind of been talking through it as we've been going along, but is to change that unit of analysis.
We've got to know what we're measuring, right?
Yeah, we need to shift our thinking from how much does this person produce to instead asking, how does this person affect organizational productivity? That question includes the person's individual contribution, but it also requires us as leaders to look at the system around them, to look at who they're working with, to look at the productivity of all those people. Then subsequent questions that we can follow with, are things like, does this person share knowledge? Do colleagues seek them out or do they avoid them? Do they strengthen the performance of less experienced people? Do they give credit or take it? Do they use resources fairly or hoard them? Do people become more capable because of their presence? Does their personal success depend on everyone else absorbing the cost? Those are the kinds of questions that we really have to start asking. And I think that's the first step in this practical sort of thing.
I mean, it seems like answering those questions could really take some work. I mean, you're talking about how one person's performance affects not just one other person. You can't even go to one other source. Like, you've got to go to the entirety of the team. And leaders may have to intentionally search for that information because organizations rarely measure those things, right? Yeah. Well, this person A is affecting person B, and person B used to be doing better. Now they're sort of doing okay. They're still meeting their metrics, but they're not succeeding like they were. A dashboard can show productivity, revenue, publications, or sales, but it probably won't show the people who stopped asking for help. The group that has learned to work around the person, or those who transferred to a different group or left the organization entirely because of that other person. The leader has to listen for those patterns. I mean, it's a little bit like people trying to trace an outbreak of some bacteria. Not to hit the, but like, okay, you got this, but how many people did you interact with? I mean, it becomes one of those type of puzzles that you're trying to solve, but you've got to first look for it, right? You've got to know that
Yeah.
you need to look for it.
You're absolutely right. And that's the first step. That's the first step in actually doing something about it, is to start investigating that. And after that step, once you can see a consistent pattern, the next step is to address the behavior directly. The behavior, not the person, not a personal attack, but the behavior. You don't label the person as selfish. Hey, you're a selfish jerk. But instead, identifying specific actions and explaining their effect, you might say, hey, you're producing excellent individual results, and we really value your expertise here. But at the same time, I'm seeing some behaviors that are really reducing trust and making it harder for people to work with you effectively. Then you have to describe those behaviors clearly. Maybe the person withholds information or claims credit for other people's work. Maybe they ask others for help all the time, but then they never help anyone else. They might monopolize opportunities or consume unreasonable shares of what is supposed to be shared resources. And so our goal as leaders is not to attack the person's character, because that will never go well.
Mm.
The goal is to make the expectation clear. Helping the team succeed is part of your performance.
Yeah, and that's really important because many organizations say they value teamwork while measuring only individual output. If the system rewards only personal achievement, then it would make sense that the selfish high performer would conclude that what they are doing is exactly what the organization values, right? The leader has to make the fuller standard explicit, like football, like what should the incentive for their contract be? Is it individual receiving yards and individual touchdowns? Or is it, you get a bonus when the team wins? Like how you write that contract, and at this, I'm talking about pay, how you do that, how you measure that is what you're telling them you value.
Yeah. And for those that you have these conversations with, you have to define really clearly what change would look like. We have a tendency to say silly things that are too vague, like, hey, be more of a team player.
Mm.
Okay, well, how do you define that, right? So really being explicit about what the expectation is for how they should be a part of the team and what they should be contributing. Setting those expectations is vital, and it might involve things like sharing information, acknowledging contributions, supporting others, those sorts of things that we hit on earlier. And then when you've set that expectation, you got to follow up on it. You have to watch to see what happens. Does this person actually follow through on it? Do they accept responsibility? Do they change, or are they just pantomiming when you're watching? Conversely, they may go in a totally different direction. They may deny the problem, blame everyone else, continue behaving the same way. If that's the case, then it's a totally different next conversation. But we'll cover that later in this 5-part series. For now, the point is that a leader should not allow visible output to end the evaluation.
The next step would be if the behavior does not change. If you've clearly sort of spelled it out, the leader eventually has to act or has to be given the power to act. Otherwise, the organization is not really setting an expectation. It's making a suggestion that, if there's no consequence, like my children would say, could be completely ignored.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. The leader may need to impose consequences, change the responsibilities, limit opportunities, and it's getting harder, or ultimately determine whether that person can remain a member of the organization. But that decision has to follow a more complete understanding of performance. And our goal here isn't to squash that person's ambition or punish productivity. We absolutely need and want talented, ambitious, highly productive people, but the best performers raise the tide of all boats. They do more than just produce. They make other people better. And that's what we should be looking for. Somebody who's strengthening the system and leaving the organization more capable than they found it. That should be our standard.
Yeah, you think about those high performers that are detrimental to organizations. You've mentioned one, Terrell Owens. And on the flip side, there's always those high performers. And the one that comes up is sort of Tom Brady. Like, he, for what I have read, seemed to always make those around him better.
Yeah.
It was interesting. They were doing a story. They're like, he knew the name of the people on the scout team. And he'd be like, hey, man, I saw how hard you were running on the scout team. I think that's really going to help the team prepare for the next team and blah, blah, blah. And then he would come back to him and be like, the way you helped us prepare for that really helped us win. And it's like you said, like the high performer is probably in the best position to have a positive and negative impact on the team.
Yeah, they're visible
because of how much they bring to it. I mean, that's when we talk about cost, we're just talking about, okay, what is the negative effect taking where they were to where it is now? But if you really want to look at the cost, and you're talking about impossible to measure, is if you didn't do that, if you did the opposite, if you made those around you better, what is the delta between what we could be and what you are diminishing us to? And that is a huge cost. It's like, what if you brought somebody else in and they were able to not diminish those around them, but actually in the same high performer state, raise the standard, raise the team?
Yeah, I think that's what our listeners need to be asking themselves is, what is the cost? What is the cost you're willing to tolerate because of your selfish high performer that you're letting get by with some stuff? In the next episode of this series, we're going to explore the question of a time horizon. Are you trying to go fast or are you trying to go far? We'll examine why selfish high performers may accelerate short-term results while weakening the organization's capacity for sustained success. So you want to be on the lookout for that next episode. Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Science of Leadership. We hope today's discussion gave you practical tools and a deeper understanding of how you can become a better leader starting today. Remember, leadership is about helping those we lead do great things. It's a journey of continual growth and learning. When we embrace that journey with curiosity, courage, and humility, we can confront challenges, overcome barriers, and foster environments where everyone can succeed. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow or subscribe, leave a comment, and share the episode with others who are passionate about leadership. Until next week, keep leading with character, competence, caring, and communication. This is Tom Collins. Let's keep growing.